There's something quietly transformative about the years that come after 60. Society often paints this stage of life as one of winding down, of retreating from the world, as if the best days are behind us. But if you listen closely, you'll hear a different story, one that whispers of possibility, growth, and a profound rediscovery of connection. Because the truth is, the golden years hold a special kind of magic, an opportunity to reawaken parts of ourselves we may have long forgotten. Many people, as they approach or cross into their 60s, find themselves facing a unique set of challenges. Children have grown and moved on, careers have wrapped up, and old friendships may have faded. It's easy then to feel isolated or invisible. But this moment, as daunting as it might seem, can also be the most fertile ground for forming new, meaningful relationships. Relationships that are not bound by the superficial or fleeting, but rooted in shared experience, authenticity, and mutual respect. What makes connection at this stage so powerful is its depth. Unlike the casual acquaintances of youth or the busyness of earlier adulthood, these new bonds come with the richness of life lived fully. They are conversations that linger late into the evening, shared laughter that echoes long after, and moments of quiet understanding that speak volumes without words. But finding these connections requires something vital: an open heart and a spirit willing to explore. It means stepping beyond the familiar walls of routine and comfort, sometimes venturing into places we never expected to find companionship. It's about challenging the narratives that tell us it's too late to meet new people, to fall in love again, or to make friends who change the way we see the world. This chapter of life invites us to rethink what it means to grow older, not as a slow fading into the background, but as an awakening to new possibilities. It's a call to curiosity, to embracing vulnerability, and to celebrating the timeless human need for connection. Because no matter our age, we all crave belonging, understanding, and the simple joy of being seen. As you journey through these pages, you'll discover surprising places where attractive, interesting people gather, people just like you, ready to spark new conversations and create lasting memories. From bustling community centers filled with laughter, to quiet libraries where stories connect souls, from volunteer groups united by purpose, to travel adventures that open doors to the world and the heart. So if you've ever wondered where the vibrant, engaging connections can be found after 60, prepare yourself to see the world through a fresh lens. This isn't a story about endings, but about new beginnings, about reigniting your social life and rediscovering the joy that comes with genuine human connection. The journey starts here, with an open mind and a brave step into the unexpected. Let's explore together how the years after 60 can be filled with not just companionship, but the kind of relationships that enrich your spirit and transform your everyday life. There's a unique energy that pulses through community centers, the kind that invites you to step inside and immediately feel a part of something bigger. For many after 60, these places become unexpected hubs of vitality, laughter, and friendship. They're more than just buildings. They're sanctuaries where shared interests spark connections that blossom into meaningful relationships. Imagine walking into a lively room filled with people who share your passion for books, gardening, art, or even chess. The atmosphere is warm, welcoming, a space where conversations flow easily because everyone has one thing in common: a genuine enthusiasm for something they love. It's here that strangers become companions, and companions sometimes become lifelong friends. Book clubs, for example, are much more than just about discussing the latest novel. They're a gathering of minds, a forum where ideas bounce and emotions are shared. These clubs nurture deep conversations that transcend the pages of a book, allowing members to connect on levels both intellectual and emotional. And it's not unusual for these meetings to evolve into coffee dates, weekend outings, and celebrations, each encounter weaving tighter threads into the social fabric of your life. Hobby groups work in much the same way. Whether it's painting, pottery, bird watching, or dance classes, the joy of shared activity creates a natural space for connection. Engaging in a hobby not only enriches the mind and body, but also opens doors to people who bring fresh perspectives and vibrant energy. You'll find that the simple act of doing something together often leads to unexpected conversations, shared laughter, and an organic bond that feels effortless yet profound. Community centers also offer a rich tapestry of events, from guest lectures and movie nights to fitness classes tailored for seniors. Each activity becomes an opportunity to step outside the usual routines, to meet people whose paths might never have crossed otherwise. It's a reminder that the later years don't mean narrowing your world. They mean expanding it with intention. What's truly beautiful about these spaces is the spirit of inclusivity. Here, age, background, and life story become chapters of a shared narrative rather than barriers. Everyone arrives with their own unique experiences, and yet they come together with openness and respect, eager to learn from one another. In these moments, the stereotype of isolation begins to dissolve. Instead, a vibrant mosaic of friendships emerges, each piece adding color and depth to the canvas of your life. This is where the magic of shared interests turns into something much greater, a community that supports, uplifts, and inspires. So if you find yourself wondering where to meet people who spark joy and curiosity after 60, consider the humble community center or a local club. They are treasure troves of possibility, waiting for you to step through the door and discover the richness of connection that awaits. There's a special kind of magic in giving, especially when that giving becomes a bridge to new friendships and unexpected connections. For many people over 60, volunteering is not just about offering time or skills. It's a pathway to purpose, community, and vibrant social life. When you step into a volunteer role, something shifts. You're no longer just an individual seeking company. You become part of a collective mission, a shared vision to make a difference. Whether it's helping at a local food bank, tutoring children, caring for animals, or supporting environmental causes, volunteering attracts people who are compassionate, driven, and deeply connected to the values of kindness and service. This shared passion often forms the foundation for meaningful relationships. In these settings, conversations aren't superficial. They're rooted in genuine care and mutual respect. You'll find yourself surrounded by people who inspire you, challenge you, and open your eyes to new ways of seeing the world. Together, you celebrate small victories and face challenges, creating bonds that can feel as strong and lasting as family. But volunteering offers more than just social connection. It also brings remarkable health benefits. Studies show that seniors who volunteer regularly tend to experience lower rates of depression, improved cognitive function, and even increased longevity. The sense of purpose that comes from helping others lights a spark inside, one that fuels happiness and resilience. Many who volunteer speak of unexpected friendships blossoming from these experiences, friendships that enrich their lives far beyond the tasks at hand. Sometimes, these relationships evolve into deep companionship or even late-life romance, proving that it's never too late to find love or lifelong friends. The beauty of volunteering lies in its reciprocity. While you give your time and energy, you receive so much more in return: joy, connection, and a renewed sense of self-worth. It's a reminder that our value does not diminish with age. It transforms and often grows richer. So if you're looking for a way to meet interesting, attractive people who share your heart and values, consider stepping into the world of volunteering. It's a space where your efforts create ripples of kindness, and where new, meaningful connections await, sometimes in the most surprising and wonderful ways. There's something profoundly invigorating about stepping into a classroom after 60, not as a student burdened by obligation, but as a curious explorer eager to absorb new knowledge. Learning together with others becomes a powerful way to spark connection, ignite passions, and rewrite the story of what aging looks like. Classes and workshops designed for seniors offer more than just information. They provide fertile ground for friendship and shared growth. Whether it's mastering a new language, exploring photography, diving into creative writing, or embracing digital skills, the act of learning side by side creates an instant bond. It's a collective journey where each person brings their unique experiences, perspectives, and insights to the table. In these settings, the classroom becomes a vibrant community. You're surrounded by people who, like you, have chosen to keep their minds open and their hearts engaged. The shared challenge of tackling new concepts and skills fosters a sense of camaraderie, encouragement, and mutual respect. It's a place where questions are welcomed, mistakes are embraced as part of the process, and achievements, big or small, are celebrated together. Beyond the cognitive benefits, which research consistently highlights as crucial for brain health and longevity, learning in community nurtures emotional well-being. It combats isolation and creates a sense of belonging. When you see familiar faces week after week, relationships deepen naturally, rooted in the shared experience of discovery. Workshops with their hands-on approach add another layer of connection. They invite collaboration, creativity, and conversation. Working on projects together, whether it's crafting, cooking, or even group travel planning, opens doors for spontaneous interaction and laughter, turning classmates into friends. What's particularly beautiful about learning together after 60 is the freedom it offers. This is no longer about performance or grades. It's about joy, curiosity, and personal growth. You have the space to pursue interests purely for the love of it, surrounded by peers who understand the unique rhythms of this stage in life. So if you're seeking fresh connections that enrich both mind and spirit, consider enrolling in a class or workshop. It's a vibrant world where growth is shared, friendships flourish, and every lesson learned is a step toward a fuller, richer life. Sometimes, the most meaningful connections happen in the most ordinary places, places we might pass by every day without a second thought. But after 60, these unexpected spots often become fertile ground for meeting interesting, attractive people who share your zest for life. Take the local market, for example. The bustling energy of a farmer's market or a neighborhood bazaar is a feast for the senses. The colors of fresh produce, the scent of herbs, the friendly chatter of vendors and shoppers alike. Here, conversations flow naturally. Maybe it's a shared appreciation for the best tomatoes or a quick recipe exchange that sparks a smile. These moments, small as they seem, open doors to deeper interactions and new friendships. Parks offer another quiet yet powerful backdrop for connection. Whether you're walking your dog, practicing Tai Chi at dawn, or simply sitting on a bench enjoying the sunlight filtering through the trees, these green spaces invite a slower pace and a readiness to engage. The park becomes a meeting ground where smiles turn into greetings, greetings into stories, and stories into companionship. There's something universally comforting about nature that softens barriers and encourages openness. And then there are libraries, those timeless sanctuaries of knowledge and calm. Beyond the bookshelves and reading nooks, libraries host events, book clubs, and discussion groups that attract a vibrant community of lifelong learners. The hushed ambience and shared love of stories create a unique atmosphere where connections form quietly but deeply. It's a place where curiosity brings people together, bridging generations and backgrounds. What makes these everyday places so special is their accessibility. They remind us that connection doesn't always require grand plans or special invitations. Sometimes, it's about being present in the moment, open to the possibilities that surround us in our daily lives. After 60, when routines might seem set and predictable, rediscovering these spaces with fresh eyes can lead to surprising encounters. It's in the casual hellos, the shared smiles, and the small acts of kindness that friendships begin to take root. So next time you visit the market, take a leisurely stroll in the park, or browse the shelves at your local library, remember, These everyday places hold the potential for extraordinary connections, if only we allow ourselves to see them. The world after 60 is a vast canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences, and two of the most powerful brushes for this are travel and technology. Together, they open doors to connections that stretch far beyond the familiar, expanding your social horizons in ways you might never have imagined. Travel has a way of shaking up routines and breathing fresh energy into life. Whether it's a weekend getaway, a group tour designed for seniors, or a solo adventure to a distant land, stepping into new environments invites encounters with fascinating people. Shared journeys become shared stories, moments of laughter on a bus, conversations over a meal, or quiet reflections at sunset, all weaving bonds that transcend age and background. Travel also teaches flexibility and openness, qualities that naturally attract others. When you're curious, adventurous, and willing to embrace the unexpected, you radiate a magnetic energy that draws kindred spirits. It's in these moments, away from home and comfort zones, that connections often spark most vividly. But in today's digital age, technology is just as vital in creating social bridges. From video calls with family to social media groups tailored for seniors, from online hobby forums to virtual classes, technology keeps the world at your fingertips. It allows you to nurture existing relationships and forge new ones, regardless of physical distance. Many seniors discover online communities where their passions, be it gardening, history, or even classic movies, find a vibrant echo. These virtual spaces become lively hubs for exchange, support, and friendship. And as technology continues to evolve, the ways to connect multiply, from virtual travel experiences to apps that help find local meetups or volunteer opportunities. Of course, embracing technology can be daunting, but it's also empowering. Learning to navigate this digital landscape is itself a form of growth, opening doors to new skills and social circles. And the beauty is, you're never alone. There are countless resources and friendly guides ready to help you make technology work for you. So, whether you're boarding a plane to an unfamiliar city or simply logging into a virtual book club, remember, travel and technology are more than just tools. They're gateways to connection, adventure, and an ever-expanding community of people eager to share life's next chapter with you. As we journey through life beyond 60, one truth becomes increasingly clear. Connection is not merely a desire. It is a profound necessity. It is the thread that weaves meaning into our days, the light that brightens even the quietest moments, and the force that renews our spirit time and time again. To embrace new connections is to embrace life itself. Whether found in a bustling community center, a quiet park bench, a shared volunteer effort, a lively classroom, or even through the screens of technology, each interaction holds the potential to transform us. These encounters remind us that aging is not about retreating into solitude, but about expanding our circles of friendship, of purpose, and of joy. Philosophically, this is the essence of renewal, the courage to open our hearts anew, to seek out the unknown, and to cherish the unexpected gifts that each person brings. It is a dance of vulnerability and strength, a balance between holding onto who we are and allowing ourselves to grow beyond what we thought possible. In these connections, we find not only companionship, but also the deep wisdom that comes from shared stories and mutual understanding. We learn that attractiveness transcends physical appearance. It resides in the spark of curiosity, the warmth of empathy, and the radiance of an engaged spirit. So, as you move forward, remember this. Your next meaningful connection might be waiting in the most unexpected place, waiting for you to say hello, to listen, to share. Keep your heart open, your mind curious, and your spirit adventurous. The best chapters of your life may still be unfolding. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. If you found value in this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more insights that celebrate the beauty and wisdom of life after 60. Together, let's continue to explore, connect, and thrive.